You are seated, quite comfortably, in the middle of the 5th century BCE. The sun is mild, not harsh, and the stones of Delphi are warm but not hot. Apollo's temple sits not in divine splendor today, but in a condition best described as functional. It is the day before the spring equinox, and that means if the accounts are even remotely accurate, Apollo is expected to present a new scale. Not metaphorically, mind you, a literal new musical scale. And this isn't out of divine whimsy. No, it's the result of a rather boring civic decree issued by the Temple of the Muses to standardize sound intervals for Pan-Hellenic choral competitions. A regulatory problem, one might say. You wouldn't think the gods care about tuning forks and pitch alignment, but this is ancient Greece, and mythology often intersected with municipal matters more than the stories let on. The setting, Delphi at its bureaucratic best. The sanctuary of Delphi, nestled on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, is usually remembered for its Pythia, the oracle with cryptic riddles and sulfuric trances. But less often noted is the labyrinthine back office behind the temple, the telestai, temple managers, papyrus pushers, priests of minor order, inventory checkers, and sacred property recorders. These men and a few women kept track of offerings, cleaned the oil lamps, and yes, maintained records of the various scales used in sacred hymns. There were complaints last season that some city-states had begun tuning their lyres slightly sharp to gain an acoustic edge in the amphitheaters. A formal protest was filed from Thebes. It was accepted, reluctantly. The result: Apollo was asked by decree of his own temple's bureaucrats to invent a new scale, something definitive, something hard to cheat. Apollo's problem, the mathematics of sound. Apollo, known for being golden-haired and radiant, was in truth a rather irritable problem solver when it came to music. Not because he lacked skill he had invented the lyre, after all, but because he disliked questions without clean answers. Unfortunately, tuning is not a clean science. The Pythagorean model of tuning based on mathematical ratios of string length had become popular, but Apollo found the minor third unstable. He reportedly told the philosopher Philolaus that it trembles like a cowardly hoplite. So here he was, on the eve of the equinox, attempting to standardize the musical scale not by divine inspiration, but by experimental adjustment. He tried string lengths, reed thickness, pressure systems in Aulos pipes, and even ordered a set of bronze tuning bells to be forged to his specifications. One was cracked, and here lies the core of our tale. The broken string. Apollo had a favored lyre, not the one given to him by Hermes, that one he kept in Olympus, but a practical one, used for earthly demonstrations. On this day, in a room behind the main temple wall, he tightened a string just a touch beyond what the gut could bear. It snapped. The sound was not so much a twang as a sigh, followed by a gentle slap against the cedar frame. The high priests present were scandalized. An apprentice scribe recorded it as an omen. The assistant to the assistant of the archivist suggested postponing the unveiling of the new scale. Apollo stared at the snapped string for a long time. Then he reportedly sat down and stared into nothingness. That's what makes it myth, perhaps. But the rest, the tension between sonic mathematics and musical pragmatism, is oddly believable. The Athenian delegation arrives. Later that day, a delegation from Athens arrived to inspect the scale. They brought their own lyres, tuned according to Attic preference. Their leader, a man named Cleonides, had written an unpublished treatise on rhythm and considered himself Apollo's equal in understanding musical theory. This made the situation worse. Cleonides asked why the temple had not used the enharmonic tetrachord as a base. Apollo replied that it was too clever for its own good. A heated discussion ensued, though with the calm and stilted rhetoric typical of high-level ancient disputes. No shouting, just slow, methodical disappointment. That evening, no scale was presented. Apollo disappeared to the Mount Parnassus slopes with a new length of string and a tuning fork. The role of the temple staff. Behind the scenes, the low-level staff had their own problems. The parchment describing the prior year's tuning protocols had gone missing. One suspect, a bored cupbearer named Timon, admitted to using it to line a basket that held pomegranate seeds. There were no backups. The head of inventory issued a directive: recreate the prior year's tuning by ear. But whose ear? They assigned the task to an elderly priestess who hadn't performed publicly since the Peloponnesian War started. She could remember the melody, but not the intervals. By midnight, one official scale had been reconstructed allegedly close to the original. But whether it was what Apollo wanted was another matter. A moment of reflection. So there Apollo sat under a low moon with a snapped lyre, a tuning fork, and a minor crisis in tonal standardization. The temple staff waited. The Athenians grumbled. The Thebans took notes. No one could agree on whether the day's silence was a divine mystery or administrative failure. And as the cicadas hummed gently around him, Apollo was said to hum too, not in divine tones, but in awkward, uncertain thirds. He was experimenting with an alternative tuning based not on fifths or fourths, but on what felt balanced. It was a dangerous idea. After all, if a god changed the tuning of music, who could say what else might shift? Would it affect hymn structure, ceremonial marches, the acceptable pitch for ritual lamentations? The broken string may have been minor, but it had become symbolic. The sun rose behind Mount Parnassus, casting long shadows through the Doric columns of the Temple of Apollo. The usual daily rites began with yawns, not fervor. The Pythia remained in her chambers undisturbed. Outside the temple proper, a group of mid-ranking officials stood near a small marble table, sipping watered wine, discussing what they now called the string incident. Inside, the temple was unusually quiet. Normally, the morning air would be filled with soft plucks and hums as musicians practiced before visitors arrived. But today, there was only one sound: the slow scratch of stylus on wax tablet as a junior archivist tried to recreate the musical interval that was lost. He would write a notation, hum it, furrow his brow, then scrape it out and begin again. This was not a myth in motion. This was administration in crisis. Apollo's experiments on the hillside. Apollo had not returned. According to a wandering goat herd named Lyxus, the god had been seen sitting on a flat rock halfway up the slope, playing one string over and over again, testing lengths and tensions, muttering numbers. The goat herd, having no taste for mathematics or divinity, left quickly. What was Apollo trying to do? Scholars now believe he was pursuing a scale based on irrational numbers intervals that could not be cleanly expressed as ratios. This would have been heresy in the world of Pythagorean music theory, which was built on sacred harmony in simple ratios. 2. 1 for the octave, 3, 2 for the fifth, 4, 3 for the fourth. Apollo's problem was philosophical. What if harmony was not simple? What if divinity could be complex? His experiments, reconstructed centuries later from dusty fragments, suggest he was trying to create a microtonal scale using quartertones or smaller intervals, attempting to capture the nuances of human speech and emotional expression, rather than the mathematical ideals of consonants. But this was too new, too ambiguous, and deeply, deeply boring to those without perfect pitch. The delegation reactions, political tuning. Back in Delphi, the various city-state representatives were losing patience. The Spartans were confused, having only attended to show they could sit still for an afternoon. The Athenians were increasingly confident that the gods' hesitation was an implicit endorsement of their own system. The Thebans, always practical, began drafting a contingency plan for standardizing music based on the average vocal range of their chorus boys. Musical preference had become political, again. A minor official from Corinth proposed a vote. His argument was procedural. If the god is unavailable, perhaps the council should ratify a tuning model based on common usage. The idea nearly passed. Had it gone through, the ancient Greek world may have adopted a standardized scale not from Olympus or philosophical inquiry, but from choral performance averages over the past 10 years. Art would have been reduced to committee, music to civic precedent, but the vote was interrupted by the sudden return of Apollo. The return of the god. Apollo returned in silence. He entered the temple wearing a simple wool cloak, carrying a new lyre, one that he had evidently carved himself overnight from cypress wood. It had 7 strings, but the tuning pegs were oddly placed. No one had seen this model before. He did not speak, he merely played. The music, they say, was soft, uncertain, and drifting. There were no clear intervals. It floated between the known notes like mist. Some listeners thought it beautiful. Others felt disoriented, unsure where the melody was going. A few scribes tried to notate it. They failed. The god plucked the final note, which rang for an unusually long time, then dissipated into silence. The room remained still. Even the birds outside were quiet. He turned to the audience and said only, "This is the scale of uncertainty. It fits the world as it is, not as we pretend it to be." Reactions and resistance. This was not well received. The Athenians accused him of undermining clarity and order. The Thebans suspected this was a diplomatic maneuver to avoid favoring any one city-state's tuning. The Spartans, in their briefest public statement on record, said simply, "We don't like it." Even within the temple there was unrest. The high musician, an elder named Mestor, quietly approached Apollo after the demonstration and requested a clarification of the scale's intervals. Apollo reportedly said, "They change depending on when you play them." This was not helpful. Later that afternoon, Mestor would submit a formal protest document titled "On the Inconsistency of the Divine Scale and its Unsuitability for Liturgical Use." It was signed by 23 members of the temple choir. The legacy of the lost scale. Despite the protests, the performance had happened. A god had presented a new scale, even if it defied notation. Some younger musicians found inspiration in it. A few tried to replicate the lyre's tuning by ear. Most failed. One succeeded briefly, only to go mad trying to write it down. There were whispers that the scale could only be played at certain times of day, or only under a particular phase of the moon. Others believed it was a test, a divine joke to reveal who truly understood the soul of music, not just its form. Apollo refused to play it again. In later years, a small cult formed in Thessaly that worshipped Apollo as the god of dissonance. They held annual concerts at dawn, using non-traditional instruments made from bone and reed. Their compositions were described as haunting, difficult, and often unlistenable. Meanwhile, the bureaucracy adjusts. While the philosophers and musicians debated, the temple staff took action. They published a new tuning model based on the previous year's average chorus pitch, with a disclaimer that it was subject to divine revision. This model, known as the Delphic Compromise Scale, became the standard for the next 2 decades. It wasn't precise, but it worked well enough, and importantly, it could be reproduced. The broken string was mended, the cracked bell was recast, the Pythia resumed her oracles, daily temple functions went on. Apollo returned to Olympus, and the wax tablet on which the god had written his new scale, if he had ever written it, was never found. Some say it melted in the sun. Others believe it was deliberately destroyed. But for those who had heard the melody that morning, the memory lingered, not in exact tones, but in the feeling, a sense that the world could be more flexible than the ratios allowed. Several weeks passed after Apollo's unorthodox musical demonstration. The city-state delegations returned home. The temple resumed its usual rhythms, offerings, rituals, careful scroll-keeping, and the constant low-level debate over how many olives constituted a sacred donation. But something subtle had shifted. Among the temple scribes, there was now a quiet hesitation when recording musical notations. Some claimed that certain intervals, once deemed perfectly harmonious, now sounded oddly stiff, mechanical even. The musicians would say they couldn't quite feel the fourth anymore. In private, a few admitted to waking with half-remembered dreams of that ambiguous melody Apollo had played. They couldn't reproduce it, but the emotional trace lingered like the echo of a phrase you can't place, or a color you almost remember. And so Delphi returned to itself, but not entirely. Athens tries to quantify the divine. Predictably, the Athenians refused to let the matter lie. Within a year, the Philosophical Academy of Choral Sciences, a short-lived institution founded by Cleonides, the same Athenian who had questioned Apollo directly, released a 12-scroll treatise titled On the Unstable Scales and Their Civic Dangers. This text warned that Apollo's dissonant tones might erode civic unity by encouraging emotional unpredictability in music. One scroll explored the idea that harmonic inconsistencies could lead to poor marching rhythm among hoplite troops. Another speculated that sadder music might reduce tax compliance during the spring months. A brief Athenian law known as the Tuning Stability Act was passed to ensure all public performances adhered to the Delphic Compromise scale. It lasted 3 months. Eventually, the people grew bored. The law faded. The treatise was shelved in the basement of the Lyceum. But a single footnote from one of the scrolls, Apollo's melody resists transcription, therefore resists governance, was later rediscovered by anarchist flute players in late Hellenistic times. The rise of the dissonant guilds. A quieter, slower development occurred not in Athens or Sparta, but in the small port town of Phaeacia. There, a group of traveling musicians, many of them failed competitors from the choral games, began experimenting with interval wandering. These players would open performances with conventional hymns, then gradually slide into tunings that no one could quite follow. Sometimes it was beautiful, other times it was barely tolerable, but they attracted an audience. They called themselves the ochre, after the tonal modes of earlier Greek music, but their modes had no names, only sensations. One felt like standing in a cold fog. Another like trying to remember a lost friend's voice. A third had the vague taste of pomegranate and salt. It was said that the ochre believed Apollo had not broken his string by accident. They claimed it was a deliberate crack in the established order, an invitation for mortals to invent their own harmonies. By 430 BCE, their music had reached Rhodes, where it was performed in a symposium for sleepy students. Most fell asleep during the performance. One wrote a fragment afterward. They played something like Rain Not Falling. What happened to the lyre? As for the strange lyre Apollo crafted and played, it was never seen again after that day. Some said it had been returned to the slopes of Mount Parnassus and buried under a cypress tree. Others claimed it had been hidden within the temple archives, sealed in a bronze box labeled only not for use. A third rumor, much quieter and considered blasphemous, held that the lyre had simply vanished not physically, but in significance. That is, once it had played its song, its purpose was fulfilled, and it returned to conceptual silence. Much like a forgotten dream. The myth becomes boring, then important. Over the following centuries, the story of Apollo's broken string entered the oral tradition in an oddly diminished form. In some versions, it became a parable about overreaching perfection. In others, a cautionary tale about the dangers of tuning experiments. By the Roman era, it had been reduced to a few lines in a temple tour script. Here, Apollo once tried a new scale. It was not adopted. But in the margins of a 1st century CE scroll, found in a dry cavern near Pergamon, a temple scribe wrote, This story is not important for its music but for its pause. The god hesitated, and we heard something strange. That scribbled line became the motto of an obscure school of musical philosophy in Alexandria. They called themselves the Hesitants. They believed all music should include one moment of deliberate uncertainty, where the performer wasn't sure what note came next. Some would say this was simply a lack of rehearsal, but the Hesitants believed it was spiritual. What does it all mean? When we think of Apollo today, we picture light and clarity, rational order, mathematical beauty, the lyre as symbol of balance and proportion. But the story of the broken string reminds us that even a god of harmony could lose the thread. Not in anger, not in divine punishment, but in contemplation. He wasn't angry when the string snapped, he was curious. And maybe that's the dull but powerful truth beneath the myth, that even divine music requires revision, that perfection is occasionally boring, that a cracked bell, a missing parchment, and a tired god with a tuning fork can nudge a civilization toward new questions even if they're small, even if they don't last. Music, after all, is not always what's written. It's also what is lost, broken, or misremembered. And the scale Apollo never finished. Maybe you've heard it too, in a dream between the sounds. You might think that the glory of Athens, the democracy, the sculpture, the naval prowess came from its thinkers, generals, oracles, and orators. And to an extent, you would be right. But beneath the marble and myth, there was a much quieter power at play. The olive tree. Not just as a symbol, not even primarily for the oil, but for how it was counted. Yes, counted. And not by farmers, but by a class of minor civil servants whose lives were shaped by parchment, shadow, and season. They were known as the Morii Logisti, literally, the sacred olive tree accountants. Their job: track and document the location, output, and legal status of every olive tree deemed sacred to Athena within Athenian territory. It was dull, methodical, and deeply political. And their ledgers, largely forgotten by history, shaped legal disputes, land rights, temple funding, and even military supply chains in ways most citizens never fully understood. The origins of sacred trees. In Athenian myth, the goddess Athena won the city by gifting it an olive tree, a practical offering, unlike Poseidon's saltwater spring. The tree she planted, according to tradition, stood atop the Acropolis and was replanted by the priestesses each time it died. But this wasn't just symbolism. From the 6th century BCE onward, actual groves of olive trees were designated as sacred extensions of that original offering. These were called Morii, a term meaning belonging to the goddess. The city-state claimed ownership over these trees, even when they grew on privately held land. And so arose a need to count them. But this was not a one-time inventory. The olive trees changed with the seasons. Some died, some were moved, some were pruned improperly or illegally harvested, and the penalties for violating Morii law were steep exile, confiscation of property, or even death. This made the accounting of trees a high-stakes bureaucracy. Meet the Morii Logisti. The average Morii accountant was not a glamorous figure. He wore a simple hammadion, carried a stylus and wax tablet, and walked with a slight lean developed from years of bending to measure the diameter of tree trunks. He operated under the oversight of the Areopagus Council, which treated the sacred olive records with as much seriousness as homicide cases. Each year, small teams were dispatched to inspect groves across Attica. They traveled slowly. These teams consisted of one lead accountant, one assistant, and one scribe. Sometimes, a priest or magistrate would join to verify especially disputed trees. Their duties included measuring trunk girth to detect illegal cutting, noting disease or drought damage, recording approximate oil yield from each tree, resolving ownership disputes between citizen and goddess, One logbook survives in fragmentary form preserved on pottery shards found near Eleusis. It includes entries like Tree 117b, grown from cut of original Acropolis stock planted by citizen Lysimachus, produces bitter oil. Suspect branch removal to be re-evaluated next year. Another entry, more blunt. Tree 212d, gone. Olive oil as a civic commodity. Why go to all this trouble? Because sacred olive oil was not a luxury good. It was a civic commodity used in religious rituals, sporting events, state-sponsored offerings, and as diplomatic gifts. It was also stored in the Panathenaic amphorae ceremonial vessels given to athletes during festivals, often depicting Athena on one side and a sporting scene on the other. The oil inside those amphorae came from Morii trees only. If a grove suffered drought, the city might cancel a regional games event. If trees were damaged by war, it would delay offerings to Delos or Delphi. Thus, the Morii logisti were not just bean counters, they were stewards of sacred economics. And unlike grain or silver, trees were stationary. They could be stolen only symbolically by someone pretending a tree wasn't sacred or underreporting its yield. Crimes against trees. A common offense was secret pruning, a farmer removing a few branches from a Morii tree at night to harvest oil privately. This crime was punishable by law, but convictions were rare. It was difficult to prove unless someone was caught mid-prune. More often, suspicion fell on repeat offenders who had a suspicious number of amphorae for personal use. One case, recorded in the archives of a local deme near Marathon, tells of a man named Echecrates who was accused of shaving bark from 3 Morii trees to heal his own olive stock. He claimed it was a misunderstanding. The logisti weren't convinced. A hearing was held. Witnesses testified about his night habits. Eventually, he was fined and temporarily banned from participating in the Panathenaic procession, a serious civic embarrassment. This case became a local parable, not because of the theft, but because Echecrates had filled out the wrong grove inventory form, a mistake that tipped off the inspectors. The paperwork problem. As the number of Morii trees expanded, so too did the paperwork. Each tree had its own entry. Each entry required multiple updates per year. The ledgers were stored in scrolls tied with twine, placed in cedar boxes to deter insects, and housed in the Olivian Aside building near the Agora, built specifically to store sacred agricultural data. This was probably the quietest building in Athens. Its only visitor most days was the assistant under-archivist of the trees. His job was to update the index system for the grove codes, a blend of Greek letters and numbering, which sometimes changed after administrative reforms. One year, the city attempted to convert the scrolls into tablets for faster indexing. The project was a failure. The lead archivist noted that tablets encourage brevity, which was deemed inappropriate for divine olive documentation. The tablets were repurposed for jury rosters, a system under stress. By the late 5th century BCE, the system began to strain. Athens had entered the Peloponnesian War. Trees near border regions were burned. Inspectors couldn't reach certain areas safely. Data became inconsistent. Trees vanished, reappeared, or were marked unverifiable due to hostilities. One tragic record from 421 BCE reads, Grove 8c, all trees gone, soil salted, citizen Theodorus presumed displaced, recommend deletion from inventory. Another simply said, Trees 99-104, location contested by Spartan patrol, no further visits advised. This erosion of tree data reflected broader civic instability. As Athens struggled militarily, even its sacred trees became vulnerable not just to axes, but to uncertainty. And when the trees became uncertain, so did the rituals, the festivals, the shipments, the symbols of Athena's presence. By the middle of the Peloponnesian War, Athens had lost not only many of its outer territories, but also the consistency of its records. For the Morii Logisti, this was a crisis not just of access but of logic. Tree entries were now scattered, incomplete, or contradictory. Inspectors could not verify yields from trees behind newly drawn borders. Disputed ownership surged. Temple officials were flooded with petitions from citizens claiming exemption from sacred tree tax requirements due to military ambiguity. A scribe named Zenon, working out of the secondary archive office near Piraeus, wrote in exasperation, "This year I have reviewed 137 scrolls. None match. We have 6 trees numbered 88A. One is in Thebes. One is underwater. One is apparently a goat." Revisions and retractions. To cope, a new position was introduced, the reconciliation scribe. This official's role was to go through conflicting tree reports and decide which entries to accept into truth, a phrase that would become infamous in later years. The process was surprisingly public. Petitioners could request that their grove's status be updated during a monthly hearing held under a large olive canopy outside the agora. The hearings were notoriously slow. They involved multiple witnesses, demonstration of oil samples, and occasional reenactments of branch pruning techniques. One hearing lasted 5 days and resolved only a single tree's designation from possibly sacred to functionally civic, pending olive bloom. A complaint from that session was etched into the side of a wine jug found near the Kerameikos. He said, "This is a sacred tree." She said, "No, it's just dry." The scribe said, "Let the goddess decide." No decision was made. Trees as targets. As the war dragged on, tree sabotage became a tactic. Raiding parties, sometimes Spartan, sometimes local Athenian factions, would specifically target groves marked as Morii. The idea was psychological. Damaging a sacred tree wasn't just eco-terrorism, it was a symbolic attack on the state religion. One chilling entry from the Areopagus court records reads, "A tree near Eleusis was found hacked to the root, its amphora shattered beside it. A single note carved into the bark, 'Where is your goddess now?'" This led to a city-wide increase in tree patrols. A group of older veterans, no longer fit for phalanx combat, were reassigned to guard sacred groves. They were called the Dendrophylax Tree Watchers. Their duties included nighttime patrols, documenting suspicious activity, and intervening in illegal harvesting. They were mostly ineffective, but their scrolls provide an intimate picture of Attica's slow disintegration. One report, "We found young boys throwing stones at olives. We told them the trees were sacred. They laughed." Another, "2 trees missing, found amphorae nearby, oil still warm." A silent shift in rituals. As fewer trees could be confirmed as Morii, rituals adjusted quietly. Instead of oil from specific groves, temple ceremonies began to use blended oil from multiple sources, some of them foreign. This was controversial. Purists argued that only oil from verified sacred trees should be used in offerings. Pragmatists pointed out that without oil, the offerings wouldn't happen at all. The priestess of Athena Polias, then in her 70s, reportedly said, "Athena does not count trees, she counts reverence." That remark, perhaps unintentionally, gave permission for what would become known as the era of approximate sanctity, a 2-decade period during which rituals continued with good enough ingredients. This was not universally accepted. Some temples refused the new oil. They went dormant rather than compromise. A few switched to imported oil from Egypt or Cyprus, despite the scandal this caused. Economic consequences. The olive markets react. The instability had real-world effects. Olive oil merchants, who once differentiated between sacred and secular oil for pricing, could no longer guarantee the source. Labels changed. Instead of oil from Morii Grove, amphorae were stamped with temple grade, Attic origin, sacred pending, Athena blessed per recent update. One merchant, Diodorus, pioneered a new system using clay seals marked with stylized olive branches. Each branch had a different curl pattern representing a grove. These were, in theory, verifiable by scribe consultation, but the process was cumbersome. Most buyers ignored it. By 406 BCE, olive oil fraud became one of the most common charges in the Agora's merchant court. A case file from that year includes: accused, merchant Alexias. Charge, stating oil came from 23A Grove. Said grove no longer exists. Defense, oil was inspired by 23A. Verdict, 20 drachma fine, amphora destroyed. The last complete ledger. The last known complete ledger of Morii trees dates to 413 BCE, found centuries later beneath a collapsed archive building. It listed 602 trees. Of those, 197 were marked damaged, 86 contested, and 41 pending verification. Only 278 were considered stable. But even these numbers are suspect. Notes in the margins indicate uncertainty. Tree 59F yield unusually high, possibly tampered. Tree 77B reported dead last year, now appears alive. Tree 98A, we disagree. That last note was not clarified. This ledger, though nearly useless as a functional document, has become a key archaeological source. It reveals not just what Athens valued, but how it documented that value, with a seriousness that seems excessive until you realize the stakes. They weren't just counting trees. They were measuring the borders of the sacred. One accountant's journal. In the waning years of the war, an unnamed accountant kept a private journal in the margins of his wax tablet. It survived because the tablet was reused to practice Latin several centuries later, by which point the war, the city, and the trees were all long gone. The entries were sparse, but telling. Inspected tree alone, no assistant, no priest, not even a dog. The tree leans now. I do not remember it leaning. They ask if I am still counting. I tell them, yes, but I no longer believe the numbers. It ends with, there is a tree on the hill, I do not write it down. The end of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BCE marked not just a military defeat for Athens, but an administrative collapse. With the arrival of the 30 tyrants, Sparta's puppet oligarchy, much of the civic structure that had kept the city functioning was dismantled or restructured. Among the first offices to go was the Olivian, the dusty records building where scrolls tracking sacred trees had been kept for generations. Its cedar boxes were rated for usable writing surfaces. Its caretakers dismissed. The last known assistant underarchivist of the trees was reassigned to inventory confiscated citizen property, an ironic demotion, perhaps, given his decades cataloging trees that couldn't be moved. By the following spring, the sacred olive registry had ceased entirely. No one issued new grove codes. No one revised last year's yield tables. No one marked down the slow death of tree 31C in the dry grove west of Mount Hymettus. The quiet civilian rebellion. And yet the trees did not vanish. Even without record, they endured. In some neighborhoods, farmers continued to prune carefully, whispering a prayer to Athena out of habit, not obligation. A few still left amphorae at roadside shrines during harvest season, simple clay vessels with no labels, no seals, and no claims of sacredness. This quiet persistence became a kind of civilian resistance. No laws demanded it, no priests enforced it, but the practices remained. There is evidence that certain groves, once fully regulated and restricted, opened again for communal harvests, not theft sharing, especially in hard years, Former sacred trees gave fruit without fines or ledgers. One fragment from an anonymous letter, written shortly after the restoration of democracy in 403 BCE, reads, "We do not ask whose tree it is, we ask only whether it still grows." The Morii in memory. By the middle of the 4th century BCE, the idea of the Morii had shifted. They were no longer tracked trees. They were stories spoken quietly by elders in agora corners or to children during harvest time. Some said the original tree atop the Acropolis had never truly died, that each Morii tree was just a shoot from that one root system, reaching through the earth beneath Attica like a quiet underground network. Others believed the trees could no longer be counted because the goddess no longer wished to be monitored. One playwright even joked that Apollo invented music to drown out the endless droning of olive accountants. His play, The Ledgers of Lysias, was not well received, but one line survives. He counted trees until the trees began counting him. The rebirth of civic trees. Interestingly, by the Hellenistic period, a new form of sacred tree record-keeping re-emerged. But it was no longer tied to groves or goddess rites. Instead, civic planners began planting olive trees in public spaces as memorials, each tree dedicated to a fallen soldier, a retiring statesman, or a local philosopher. These trees were not counted for their oil. They were counted for their symbolism. Inscribed plaques appeared at their roots. For Democritos, who argued under this shade. For Arista, who read to children here. For the nameless accountant who wrote of tree 98A. There is no record of who planted that last tree, no city order, no temple endorsement, just a quiet marker in a neglected garden near the Phoenix. Perhaps that too was a kind of Morii. Archaeology of the forgotten. In 1892 CE, an excavation near ancient Eleusis uncovered a series of broken amphorae buried with remarkable care. Each bore faint inscriptions along the neck, almost all of them unreadable, but one stood out. It read, "Yield unclear, sacred uncertain, important yes." The amphora now sits in a museum, labeled ceremonial vessel, provenance unknown. But for those who know the story, it is unmistakably a remnant of the Morii Logistai, the ones who cared about the olive trees, not because they were profitable or divine, but because they mattered. Because tracking something sacred, even when it slips beyond the boundaries of bureaucracy, is itself a kind of worship. The accountant's legacy. We do not know the names of most Morii accountants. They were not philosophers. They left no treatises. Their records were mundane, repetitive, and mostly unreadable to the modern eye. But in the very act of counting trees, year after year, despite war and drought and contradiction, they revealed a deeper truth about human civilization. That the sacred is not always in thunderbolts or marble, but sometimes in the insistence that a tree be noticed, again and again, even if it does nothing more than grow. Final reflection. The tree doesn't know it was counted, but the city did. And in that counting, it remembered what it stood for. You probably know the name Sisyphus. The man doomed to push a boulder uphill for eternity, only to watch it roll back down again and again. A symbol of futility, the eternal drudge, the absurd struggle. But what if that wasn't the full story? What if, before the punishment, before the mountain, before the rock, Sisyphus was something far more mundane? A record keeper. Not a mighty king, not a cunning trickster, but a man obsessed with order. His real legacy, buried under centuries of myth and metaphor, might have more to do with filing systems than divine defiance. Because buried in the dusty corners of Corinthian temple archives is evidence not of rebellion, but of paperwork. Corinth before the crime. Let's return to Corinth in the 7th century BCE, a city at the crossroads of trade, with its polished stone agoras and traffic of merchants, bronze smiths, and scribes. Sisyphus, son of Aeolus, was already prominent but not yet infamous. He was known for his obsession with records. He wasn't merely interested in collecting taxes, he wanted to track everything. Ship arrivals and cargo types, marriage licenses and dowry clauses, grain yields barrel by barrel, theft reports, and the angle of the footprints left behind. He introduced the first multi-tier civic archive in Corinthian history. Before that, most cities kept scrolls in temple basements or private chests. Sisyphus proposed a public record vault, organized by category, location, and season. In other words, a filing system. The first of its kind. The vault of clay and wind. Sisyphus ordered the construction of a 3-chamber storage building near the temple of Apollo. It was made of layered stone, and the inside was lined with shelves carved directly into the walls. Each shelf was marked with painted symbols. Red triangle pointed up for legal matters. Sheaf of rice for agriculture. Anchor for trade. Counterclockwise arrows button for matters unresolved. The scrolls were stored in clay tubes, sealed with wax and labeled with brief summaries. Some included twine tags indicating urgency. Others had color-coded ribbons, a primitive, yet effective, prioritization method. Sisyphus is said to have spent hours walking the aisles, muttering not about divine fate or rebellion, but about misfiled invoices and duplicate grain entries. He once postponed a military campaign by 2 days because a shipment of lambskin scrolls arrived with no cross-referencing marks. One record from a junior clerk survives. The king asked for scroll 37C, Maritime Disputes, Autumn, and when I brought 37B instead, he sent me back and told me I'd doomed the state. Why did he care? To understand Sisyphus, you must understand fear. Not of the gods, not of war, but of disorder. He believed that chaos begins when records break down, that a missing tax entry was not an oversight, but a warning sign of civic decay, that cities fall not from invasion, but from bad indexing. There is a chilling quote attributed to him, scratched on the inside lid of a broken wax tablet. The fall of Troy began with a miscounted fleet. We have no proof he said it, but it matches his thinking. The petition to the gods. At the peak of his civic success, Sisyphus made a bold move. He attempted to catalog divine omens. Not metaphorically, literally. He instructed scribes to record lightning strikes, goat miscarriages, eclipse timings, and patterns in bird migration. His idea was that if omens were truly signs from the gods, they should be trackable, patterned, filed. He called this project the Omnium, a logbook of the divine. It was a beautifully boring project. Temple priests resisted it. Sisyphus insisted. One wax sheet from the project reads, 7 black birds flew east at dawn past the olive tree. One defecated, unsure if this counts. And then a problem of death. The myths say Sisyphus cheated death. But the version that survives in minor epics and forgotten scholia tells a different story. He didn't escape death. He filed a complaint. According to a variant found in a late Alexandrian commentary, Sisyphus delayed his own passing by arguing that his death scroll had not been properly signed by 3 required offices: city, family, and temple. In a scene as absurd as it is believable, he is said to have told Thanatos, the personification of death, "You lack the appropriate authorizations. Return when your paperwork is complete." And Thanatos, bound by the structure of divine law, left. Sisyphus then amended his own records to mark himself as not deceased, pending clarification. The filing system expands. In the years after his bureaucratic escape, Sisyphus became obsessed with building a filing system for the afterlife. He theorized what categories Hades must use. Sins committed by type. Worship level low, moderate, obsessive. Sacrifices made by animal. Final words if available. He attempted to recreate this system in miniature in his Corinthian archives. His final project was called the Thanograph, a set of scrolls outlining possible death scenarios and their civic implications. One scroll lists: if a citizen dies during festival season, do his debts transfer to his offspring before or after the wine is blessed? It is not known if anyone ever read these scrolls seriously. But the point wasn't who read them. The point was they existed. The downfall begins. Eventually, the gods noticed. Not his deceit, not his arrogance, but something deeper. That he wasn't afraid of them, because he believed in paperwork more than divinity. To a deity, it's one thing to be disrespected. It's another to be indexed. Zeus reportedly said, "He would sort the thunderbolt if I let him." And so the punishment was devised, not for rebellion, not for hubris, but for attempting to bring filing logic to a world meant to remain mysterious. The stone as symbol. You already know the punishment: a boulder, a hill, an endless task. But consider this. What if the boulder was a metaphor for data? Heavy, unstable, always needing to be pushed into place, always falling back into chaos. Sisyphus, the bureaucrat, the clerk king, was not punished with brute labor, but with the eternal futility of imperfect systems. Each time the boulder rolled back, he saw the error in his logic. Each time he pushed, he tried to correct it, but the system, like the cosmos, refused to be filed. After his death, or more accurately, his second death, the gods commissioned what may have been the strangest investigation ever carried out in the underworld: an audit of a mortal's archive system. It wasn't enough to punish Sisyphus. They wanted to understand him. According to a fragmentary scroll found near a burned sanctuary in Arcadia, a minor chthonic deity named Menotes was assigned the task. His role: review the contents of Sisyphus, record vault, and determine whether the mortal had truly intended to undermine divine authority or merely misunderstood cosmic process. He spent 19 days in Corinth, accompanied by 2 temple archivists and a silent junior priest. He came back with a single line. He did not fear gods, he feared unfiled data. That was enough to confirm the punishment would remain, but it also revealed something unexpected. The gods didn't know what to do with the files. The scroll crisis of 685 BCE. Decades after Sisyphus' death, Corinth was left with a problem. Thousands of scrolls bearing his seal still sat in the temple vaults. No one knew which were accurate. No one dared burn them. Some feared they were spiritually protected. Others argued they were cursed. The city formed a temporary scroll evaluation committee, chaired by an aging merchant, a reluctant priest, and a blind olive farmer who claimed he had once delivered messages to Sisyphus himself. Their task was simple: determine which scrolls to preserve and which to discard. It was not simple. Out of the 4,712 scrolls initially reviewed, 57% were deemed functionally redundant. 22% referenced unknown or long-dead entities. 11% were blank or indecipherable. 8% contradicted each other. 2% were left unexplained, bearing only the symbol, counterclockwise arrows button. That symbol had no known meaning in Corinthian civic notation. Some believed it referred to unresolved status, others to be repeated. A few thought it stood for eternity. The committee dissolved after 3 meetings. No scrolls were destroyed. The room was sealed. A strange cult emerges. In the following century, a minor sect emerged in the city's outskirts, calling themselves the Keepers of the Ledger. They believed that Sisyphus had not been punished, but elevated that his endless effort to sort the universe was not a curse, but a cosmic responsibility. They prayed not for salvation, but for categorization. Their temples had no idols, only shelves. Offerings were made not in gold or wine, but in lists. Inventories of animals, collections of dreams, transcribed conversations between strangers in the marketplace. One scroll titled simply, "Things I Forgot to Do." Over time, the cult faded, but their scrolls were found centuries later, meticulously labeled, bundled with wax string, and entirely mundane. The label on the bundle read, "For the one who counts what others ignore." Sisyphus, Ghost in the Archives. One document from the early Roman period, authored by a Greek librarian in Alexandria, mentions a troubling event. The scribe, known as Hermodorus, describes discovering a misfiled papyrus in a scroll chest labeled Corinthian Civic Indexes, MISC. The scroll contained a perfectly organized chart detailing marriage dowries from the 7th century BCE, aligned with lunar cycles, political shifts, and barley prices. There was no author listed, just the faint etching of a circle and line at the top, counterclockwise arrows button. Hermodorus, puzzled, attempted to cross-reference it with known records. Every entry matched. He wrote, "The more I verify, the more I doubt the present. The past is more ordered than the now. I believe this scroll should not exist." He later notes that he tried to refile the document, but every time he placed it on the shelf, it was later found in a different box. He ended his account with, "I have ceased filing it. It now rests in the atrium. I do not touch it, but it moves." Interpretations of the boulder. By the Hellenistic era, philosophers had begun to reinterpret the myth, not as a punishment but as a mirror. The Stoics said Sisyphus represented humanity's desire to control what cannot be controlled. The Epicureans said he was a fool, distracted by structure when he could have embraced pleasure. The Platonists saw the boulder as a metaphor for matter, and the hill as the ascent to truth. But one lesser-known school, the archivists of Piraeus, saw something else. They argued that the gods were not punishing Sisyphus, but using him, that the boulder was in fact the data of the world, and that he alone was trusted to carry it uphill each day, testing its shape, adjusting its balance, cataloging its role. To them, his labor wasn't absurd, it was necessary. They said, "Each day the world changes, each night it resets. His task is not to finish but to notice." What remains of the system? Today, archaeologists believe some elements of Sisyphus' archive system influenced later bureaucratic developments in Athens and even Rome, not directly but philosophically. The idea of civic transparency through record-keeping, the standardization of scroll labels, the use of rotating classification symbols for uncertain documents. These weren't divine innovations, they were Sisyphusian. Of course, modern administration rarely credits a mythological figure, but even in 19th century European civil engineering documents, there are echoes, strange reference codes, inexplicable system loops, files marked reviewed, repeat review bearing the symbol counterclockwise arrows button. Historians dismiss this as coincidence, but you've seen the pattern by now. Legend tells us Sisyphus still labors in the underworld, but perhaps less famously, so do his records. According to late Orphic fragments discovered in the ruins of a rural Macedonian shrine, the dead who enter Hades must declare their category: warrior, poet, merchant, mother, philosopher, debtor. Each classification supposedly routes them through a different section of the afterlife's administration. And somewhere deep in that mythic system, said to be hidden behind the fifth gate of Lethe, is the archive of unfinished lives. Scribes their work not to judge the dead, but to log their inconsistencies. A hero who lied once but never admitted it. A healer who abandoned a patient to save a child. A baker who stole grain, then later fed the starving. A farmer who planted olives on sacred land, unsure if the grove was Morii or not. The documents go nowhere. They are filed endlessly without resolution. Who supervises this process? Some say it is Sisyphus himself. Not pushing a literal stone anymore, but a mountain of ambiguity, scroll by scroll, case by case, failure by footnote. Hades speaks, allegedly. A mysterious commentary falsely attributed to Plutarch, now referred to by scholars as the Dialogues with the Drowned, presents a fictionalized account of Hades speaking to Sisyphus. In it, Hades explains, "You sought a perfect record of an imperfect world. So I gave you the perfect punishment, a world that cannot be recorded completely." Sisyphus replies, "I will try anyway." A modern discovery, the scroll of redundancy. In 1967, during renovations in the ruins beneath ancient Corinth, a sealed clay jar was uncovered beneath a layer of collapsed marble. Inside, a fragmentary scroll, deeply faded but still legible under infrared imaging. The scroll was not theological, philosophical, or poetic. It was an index. It listed dozens, perhaps hundreds of entries with near-identical summaries. Most began with, "Dispute regarding property line, olive tree involved." The entries differ slightly. Neighbor says boundary stone moved. Claim of sacred tree denied, confirmed by dowry. He says land belonged to his uncle, now dead, no record. What's remarkable is that each entry has a code, a system of references to other scrolls, many now lost. But the pattern of cross-referencing is brilliant, dense, recursive, occasionally maddening. One archaeologist reviewing the scroll joked, "It's like someone tried to build a map of confusion and succeeded." Scholars now believe this scroll was part of Sisyphus' early civic dispute archive, a system not for solving problems, but for preserving the complexity of them. Because in Sisyphus' world, a dispute not yet solved was not a failure. It was a category. Echoes in the bureaucratic mind. Think for a moment of the modern world. Government forms with boxes that don't fit your situation. Hospital systems with 3 different names for the same test. Legal cases that span decades because one clause contradicts another. Every time a document resists completion. Every time you hit submit and receive an error. Every time the system tells you incomplete form, though you filled every line. You may be closer to Sisyphus than you think. Not because you're cursed, but because you are working within the architecture of ambiguity. And in a way, so was he. The lesson we almost missed. We often reduce Sisyphus to absurdity, the man forever doing a meaningless task. But the task was only meaningless if judged by outcome. What if it's judged by commitment instead? He didn't give up, not when the boulder rolled, not when the scrolls contradicted, not when the divine mocked his methods. To Sisyphus, the goal was never completion. The goal was to keep sorting, to make order however fleeting, to understand however dimly, to file even if the category was, "We don't know yet." In the Temple of Lost Things, one final image. In the mythic underworld, there's said to be a side room in the archive of unfinished lives, a small chamber no one enters. Inside, a desk. On it, a wax tablet. Next to it, a stylus. And beneath that, carved in stone. Category, attempted understanding. Clerk, Sisyphus. Status, in progress. Final reflection. Perhaps the most important task is the one that cannot be finished, but is done anyway. You've likely heard of the great Greek festivals, the Panathenaea, the Dionysia, the Eleusinian mysteries, all grand, vivid, and heavily recorded in both history and imagination. But very few remember the Thargelia. It was not loud. It wasn't built on drama or triumph. It was about survival. Held each year in late May or early June, Depending on the lunar calendar, the Thargelia was Athens' grain festival, a quiet, anxious sort of ritual, a time for cleansing, sowing, and making peace with the uncertain rhythms of agriculture. It was also, quietly, a moment of bureaucratic rebellion. Because behind the offerings and the chants, a small group of temple clerks and land agents tasked with managing the records of sacrificial fields and state-owned grain reserves made a decision one year that was never formally declared. They lied to the state. Just once. For the sake of the harvest. The setting, a city between seasons. The 6th century BCE was a time of reorganization in Athens. Solon's reforms had introduced new political structures, but they hadn't yet smoothed the economic tensions between rural farmers and urban officials. Grain supplies were everything. They were tied to taxation, military readiness, temple offerings, and the city's ability to function through winter. A poor harvest wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially destabilizing. So the Thargelia served as a ritual of preemptive correction, a way to admit early that things might go wrong and to ask for divine leniency in advance. The public remembered the songs and the sacrifices, but the administrators remembered the numbers. The bureaucracy behind the festival. Behind every Greek festival was paperwork. For Thargelia, this included inventories of sacred grain held in temple reserves, lists of field owners whose land was tied to ritual offerings, logs of surplus grain donated by citizens or seized by the state, measurements of seed weight tracked by deems districts. Each spring, 2 civil officers known as the Sitophylax, grain guardians, reviewed the previous year's data and drafted preliminary projections for the harvest to come. These were cross-checked against omens observed by priests, cloud formations, wind patterns, the behavior of goats, the condition of the first barley shoots. None of this was exact. And that was the problem. A shortfall in the numbers. The year was 534 BCE. The winter had been unusually wet, followed by an abrupt frost that damaged early plantings in the northern plains. Reports from the deme of Alope noted mildew on the first grain, mice in the secondary stores, water table risen. Inland villages sent updates that were either alarmist or eerily silent. One clerk, in the margins of a scroll, scribbled, "They are not sending weights. That usually means there is no weight to send." This was the year the grain equation didn't balance. The Sitophylax, poring over columns and cargo reports, realized that the city would fall short by nearly 17% if the harvest matched projections. This was enough to threaten the festival itself. The problem with public admission. Here was the dilemma. If they announced a shortfall before the Thargelia, the festival's entire theological purpose, a prayer for harvest, would be undermined by panic. If the gods believed the city had no faith, they might punish them further. At least that was how the logic went. Worse, announcing the shortfall early could cause grain hoarding, price spikes, or even theft. Temples might be blamed for failing in their rituals. The decision fell unofficially to a group of 5 mid-level bureaucrats stationed in a side building of the temple of Apollo Patrus. They were not high priests. They were not elected. They were simply competent. And so, over 2 evenings of whispered discussion, they changed the records. The quiet recalibration. What exactly did they do? They adjusted yield expectations upward by 8%. Not the full amount, just enough to suggest that the problem was not immediate, that if the gods smiled, the people worked hard, and the weather cooperated, everything would be fine. They also recategorized 2 demes as provisional contributors, meaning their grain was expected but not guaranteed. A footnote was added that read, "Estimates reflect optimism per Thargelic custom." That phrase, per Thargelic custom, was invented on the spot. It would appear on 6 more scrolls in the next decade. The day of the festival. When Thargelia arrived, the city celebrated as always. A pair of scapegoats, usually outcasts or criminals, were paraded and symbolically expelled to cleanse the city's sins. Offerings were made to Apollo and Artemis, patrons of agriculture and purification. The first barley cakes were baked and blessed. Songs were sung to the gods, asking for mercy on the upcoming harvest. No one outside the temple bureaucracy suspected anything unusual. But one curious line was added to the public prayer scroll. We thank the gods for the grain that will come, and the grain we believe shall come, and the grain we claim in good faith has already begun. It was written by one of the 5 clerks. No one questioned it. What the gods knew. This, of course, raises a question not often addressed in the records. Did the gods know they were being misled? Classical theology offers no consensus on whether divine beings accepted human estimates at face value, but some minor texts hint that intention mattered more than data. A hymn fragment found in a collapsed library in Delos reads, "He who lies in fear of ruin may be heard more clearly than he who chants in smug precision." In that light, perhaps the clerks weren't deceiving the gods. Perhaps they were translating panic into ritual confidence. In the weeks after the Thargelia festival of 534 BCE, Athens carried on. The prayers had been spoken, the grain offerings accepted. The scapegoats were driven from the city boundaries in a solemn yet symbolic purge. Public confidence remained high. But behind the marbled facades and festival incense, the clerks knew the truth. The yield predictions, those carefully copied figures spread across sealed scrolls, were fabricated through optimism, not observation. The phrase "per Thargelic custom" now anchored civic confidence to an invented standard. And so, the myth of the acceptable shortfall was born. The clerk's dilemma. The 5 mid-level grain clerks whose names are lost to history, but whose decisions echo in footnotes, had not expected their adjustment to become permanent policy. They thought it a temporary calibration, a single-season solution. But 2 seasons later, when another cold snap delayed the barley bloom, officials in charge of the Citophilicaion, the grain archives, reused their method. This time, the adjustment was larger. Instead of altering just the expectations, they quietly modified the records of prior harvests, retroactively increasing numbers to avoid signs of a decline. This allowed the projected numbers for the current year to appear plausibly consistent. Scrolls from 3 demes show discrepancies in official copies. The deme of Acharnai was listed with a yield of 13 weightstones of barley in one scroll, but only 9 in another, both dated the same day. One scribe wrote, "rectified per festival expectation," next to the higher figure. And so a new tradition, unspoken, unvoted, unwritten, took hold. Adjust the numbers to reflect the city's hope, not its harvest. Who benefited? It would be easy to paint this as corruption or incompetence, but that would miss the subtle truth. The clerks weren't stealing grain. They weren't hoarding or redistributing to elites. They weren't manipulating markets for personal gain. They were trying to protect ritual integrity. If the city believed it was failing in its sacred obligations, if citizens feared the gods were displeased, or the soil was cursed, it could lead to panic in rural demes, withholding of donations to temples, cancellations of festivals and weddings, civil unrest tied to failed omens. One memo from the Temple of Demeter summarizes this plainly. We keep the prayer strong by keeping the ledgers calm. This was not deceit for power. It was data as liturgy. The rise of the optimists. By 530 BCE, a quiet divide had emerged in the grain recording offices. On one side were the realist clerks and inspectors who insisted on unflinching truth in harvest reports. however grim. On the other were the optimists, those who believed that slightly adjusted figures, backed by ritual intention, sustained civic spirit more than raw numbers. No official names marked this division, but it shows in their annotations. Realist scrolls often included the word verum, truth, underlined with dots. Optimist scrolls used the phrase by sacred hope, or as intended in the margins. One surviving table shows a single grain depot listed under two separate capacities, one real, one ritual. The realist clerk noted, "For amphory, drying, low quality." The optimist added beneath, "To be offered as full by the grace of Artemis." No one corrected either line. Trouble from the northern fields. That summer, messengers from the rural deme of Thorikos arrived with concerning news. A fungal infection had devastated their early barley crop. The priest of the local shrine recommended sacrificing a goat and delaying planting, but the messenger noted something odd. The planting continued anyway. They said the records already showed success. This marked the first field-level manifestation of the optimism policy. Farmers were working to match the record, not the soil. One of the 5 original clerks, now retired, wrote in a private letter, "They act not from yield but from copy. We have shifted the axis." And yet the harvest that year was moderate, not a disaster, not a bounty. Just enough to keep the discrepancy hidden. An accidental theology. Over time, the idea that the record created the reality, rather than the other way around, took on a subtle theological weight. Temple songs began to reflect not just prayer for grain, but gratitude for the grain that had already been recorded. One lyric fragment from a choral hymn reads, "What is written in the temple vaults shall rise from earth by sacred salt. Let the gods read what we believe, and cause the harvest to achieve." The idea wasn't that the gods responded to offerings. It was that they responded to optimistic documentation. It was a bureaucratic faith. Write what you hope, and the world might follow. Early philosophical responses. Later thinkers would wrestle with this quiet evolution. A pre-Socratic fragment, attributed dubiously to Anaximander, says, "A measurement once altered shapes the sun's return." The implication being that distortion in civic truth affects the larger harmony of cosmos and polis. Others, more practical, argued that the optimists merely formalized what rituals had always done, create structure in the face of uncertainty. A temple steward named Phrynion famously defended the practice. "We lied with intention, not deception. We shaped hope to fit the ledger, so the ledger could carry hope." By 524 BCE, the Thargelia had grown even quieter. There were still sacrifices, still chants, still barley cakes arranged in neat rows beside temple altars, but the meaning had subtly shifted. What had once been a prayer for future harvest had become a thank you note for records already made. One observer, a young assistant scribe named Iatrocles, wrote in his personal notebook, "The people speak their hymns with confidence, as though they are reading back a balance already paid." He wondered if anyone truly believed the gods required the offerings anymore, or if it was enough that the ledgers were full. The quiet collapse of accuracy. The optimism policy had worked for a while, but like all systems built on adjusted expectations, it became untraceable over time. Future scribes could no longer tell which figures were precise and which had been ritualized. The grain archives became a mosaic of corrections, margin notes, contradictory entries, and reassurances written in poetic form. Scroll 441 from the deme of Melite, for instance, contains the following: Yield 14 amphorae official. Likely real yield 9 per footman's report. Ceremonial number used 12 average of hope and doubt. This method, averaging faith and fact, was called the hope median by later scholars. It was not efficient, but it was socially stable. The one who tried to fix it. Around 520 BCE, a new grain clerk named Sostratos attempted to reverse the optimism. He was young, idealistic, and recently trained in a protological school outside of Athens. Sostratos insisted that the system must return to verifiable, unadjusted data. He wrote memos to the Citophiliacs, compiled cross-referenced lists of mismatched scrolls, and even produced a full audit of the Thargelia records from the past 5 years. His conclusion: there is no single truth. The record has fractured into ritual, belief, and estimation. He proposed a new kind of scroll, triple entries per field. What was planted? What was expected? What was observed? No one adopted his system. One fellow clerk is said to have replied, "We cannot manage truth in 3 lines. The people prefer 1." Sostratos resigned the following spring. His triple-entry scrolls were repurposed for shipping manifests. A festival reclaimed by forgetting. Ironically, the more flexible the numbers became, the less people argued about them. By the end of the 6th century BCE, the ceremonial yields were accepted without debate. Demes stopped submitting actual weights, only symbols of compliance. Offerings were given based on prior year's offerings, not on current harvests. And the term Thargelia came to refer more to tradition than to grain. The gods were thanked not for food, but for memory. And slowly, the original anxiety, the fear of famine, was ritualized into calm repetition. A lost scroll, a modern discovery. In 1904, near the foundations of a collapsed granary outside modern Athens, archaeologists uncovered a sealed ceramic jar. Inside were 4 wax tablets, partially preserved, with inscriptions in a familiar bureaucratic hand. They appear to be a dialogue between 2 temple clerks, debating the moral implications of adjusting the Thargelia scrolls. The final entry, written in abbreviated Ionic, reads, "Let the gods decide what is true. Let us decide what the people can live with. Between the two, the harvest may yet come." The jar bore no ceremonial seal, no temple mark. Just one phrase etched faintly into the clay rim. Per Thargelic custom. A festival without a field. Eventually, as Athens grew more urban, the connection between festival and field disappeared. Grain was imported from Egypt and Sicily. Offerings were symbolic, not practical. Priests read scrolls, whose numbers no longer referred to real locations. And still the festival endured. Why? Because it had become a ritual of reassurance. Not to the gods, but to the city itself. When people heard the same phrases spoken, saw the same barley cakes shaped, and listened to the same songs echo through marble colonnades, they felt that stability still existed. Even if the scrolls were more poetry than math. Even if the numbers had long stopped counting. Historians' final judgment. Modern scholars disagree on whether the optimism of the Thargelia was a soft failure or a quiet success. Some see it as an early example of data manipulation, warning of the dangers of belief-driven bureaucracy. Others see it as a moment of civic resilience, the ability to maintain social order through symbolic coherence. One academic, writing in 1973, put it best. Thargelia was not a lie. It was a story told by numbers, and in times of instability, stories are often more nourishing than grain. Hermes was the god of messages, boundaries, merchants, thieves, dreams, and for a brief and mostly forgotten period, numbers. Not numbers in the Pythagorean sense sacred, harmonic, eternal truths, but numbers as they appear in daily transactions. Chickens exchanged for cloth. Amphorae of oil sold to strangers. Travel permits that had to be stamped and counted. Coins weighed for taxes on roads he himself blessed. As the god of roads and trade, Hermes had a logistical interest in efficient calculation, but like many gifted improvisers, he was impatient with systems. And so one day, whether out of frustration, curiosity, or boredom, Hermes decided to invent a counting machine. It was an abacus, sort of. The setting, a stall in the Agora. The story, as preserved in a mostly ignored Homeric fragment and later expounded upon by a Roman commentator named Plinius Minor, begins not in Olympus, but in a bustling corner of the Athenian Agora. Hermes had disguised himself as a traveling merchant, short cloak, floppy-brimmed hat, winged sandals dulled to avoid suspicion. He set up a stall with simple goods: salted olives, bronze styluses, small pine figurines of goats. The point wasn't profit, it was observation. He wanted to understand how mortals kept track of what was bought and sold. What he found disturbed him not because it was inefficient, but because it was so varied. Some traders used pebbles in cups. Others scratched lines in wax. One elderly fish seller memorized every transaction, then forgot half by dusk. Hermes, lover of cleverness, whispered to himself, "There must be a better way." The first attempt, the rolling board. Hermes disappeared for a day and returned with a wooden tray. On it were 5 grooves, each holding a row of smooth river stones. The top of the tray bore painted symbols, alchemical notations he thought looked important, though no one else recognized them. He approached a stall selling lamp oil and offered the tray to the merchant. "Use this," he said. "Move the stones instead of counting aloud." The merchant tried. He moved 1 pebble per amphora sold. After 5 transactions, he tried to tally the total. He asked, "What does this row mean again?" Hermes blinked. He had not labeled the rows. The merchant, unimpressed, returned to his pebbles in a basket method. Hermes was not deterred. The second attempt, strings and shells. Next, Hermes used strings. He threaded small seashells onto taut cords nailed to a cedar board. Each shell represented a different denomination: 1, 5, 10, 20. He called this the Court of Commerce. Unfortunately, when the board was tilted slightly, the shells slid and miscounted themselves. One fell off completely. A young boy walking past commented, "Your math has escaped." Hermes took notes. The scribe who disapproved. In a side office of the Temple of Hermes stood a professional record keeper named Philomedes, who had spent 30 years recording merchant contracts using a stylus and scroll. Hermes, still in disguise, showed him the device. Philomedes stared at it. "What problem does it solve?" "The problem of slowness," Hermes replied. "But it takes longer to explain than to count," Philomedes said. This was true. So Hermes tried again. The third attempt, divine logic, human confusion. Hermes built a 3-tier abacus, combining pebbles, shells, and adjustable bronze pins. Tier 1, past transactions. Tier 2, current calculations. Tier 3, future possibilities. The first person to use it, a barley trader, asked, "Which tier do I move first?" Hermes said, "Depends. Are you planning to sell or to remember selling?" The trader walked away, where the confusion spread. Despite its impracticality, the hermetic counting board began to appear in certain areas of the market not because it worked, but because it was sacred. Priests of Hermes began requiring merchants near his statues to bless the transaction, using the board however briefly. This led to comical outcomes. A merchant moved a pebble, then scratched his head, then accepted a coin. A buyer copied the action, unsure what it meant but feeling safer. A city inspector cited a seller for using unregistered stones, prompting an argument over whether the god's device required civic licensing. a festival demonstration. To promote adoption, Hermes hosted a demonstration during the next Hermia festival. Disguised again, he performed a miracle of counting by using the device to calculate the number of doves in a cage. It worked sort of, he was off by 2. No one noticed except the doves. A modern parallel. The fragmentary scrolls describing Hermes' device were long ignored until 18th century scholars studying early mechanical calculators came across illustrations from a ruined Alexandrian codex. One sketch shows a flat board, rows of pebbles. A footnote: too many meanings, use cautiously. This may be the earliest example of multifunctional confusion in tool design. Today, we'd call it feature creep. Despite, or perhaps because of its flaws, Hermes' counting board began to see limited adoption in the more performative corners of Athenian commerce. Vendors in high-traffic areas began to use the board not as a calculator, but as a proper way to appear more divine, more organized, more blessed by the messenger god, even if they didn't understand how it worked. A bronzesmith named Demonikos placed the device on his table next to his weights and scales, claiming it ensured divine balance in numbers. His customers never questioned his prices again. Another merchant used it to predict the market, sliding stones in different patterns and claiming the gods sent him insights through the alignment of pebbles. No two traders used it the same way, and yet none seemed willing to give it up. The lawsuits begin. Soon problems emerged. A fish seller accused a buyer of shortchanging him by 2 stones worth on the Hermes board. The buyer replied that he thought they had agreed on 3 shells minus 1 bead. Neither could prove their point. The case was brought before the market magistrate, who had never seen the device. The magistrate asked, "Where is the record?" Both parties pointed to the board. The magistrate frowned and issued a now famous ruling. That which has no column cannot be reconciled. Use wax or use silence. This statement was copied, sarcastically, onto dozens of clay jugs sold in the weeks following. A curious response from Delphi. Word of the device reached the oracle at Delphi. A delegation from Athens, seeking clarity on divine approval, asked the Pythia whether the Hermetic board was truly a tool of the gods. The response, as recorded in several stylized versions, was typically cryptic. He who counts what flows chases birds through fog. Let Hermes smile, but weigh the grain, not the wind. Interpretations varied wildly. Some said it was a rejection. Others believed it meant the board should only be used with physical commodities, not promises or projections. A few priests suggested that Hermes himself was the fog, and the board was a test of faith. No resolution came, but demand for the device briefly surged. The clerk rebellion of Kolonos. In the deme of Kolonos, a group of city clerks in charge of market tolls rebelled against the use of Hermes' device in tax assessments. Traders had begun using the board to justify inconsistent fees, claiming, "This row represents promised payment," or "These 3 stones cancel that charge." One clerk wrote bitterly, "The merchants now carry their own truths, arranged in neat confusion." In protest, the clerks returned to hand-tallied ledgers and publicly posted grain-to-obol conversion charts. A sign hung over the tax booth for 2 weeks. "Here we count the old way. 1 hand, 1 stylus, 1 number." Eventually, pressure from priestly authorities forced them to accept the Hermetic method as ceremonial, though not binding. A child corrects a god. A story preserved in the memoirs of a schoolteacher from Piraeus describes a moment of quiet rebellion. Hermes, again in disguise, visited a small tutoring stall where children learned basic arithmetic using pebbles. He showed them his board. The children tried it. One girl, Anthela, stared at the system for a long time, Then she said, "You've made it harder." Hermes laughed and offered her a small clay coin. She refused. "You didn't make a tool, you made a riddle." He asked what she would use instead. She held up her hand and said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then again. This moment, though minor, was later cited by skeptical philosophers as the first public critique of divine design in commerce. The legacy of the pebble cult. In the following generation, a strange group emerged, the cult of the 5 lines. They claimed the Hermetic abacus was not a device at all but a map of the cosmos, divided into trade, language, deception, prophecy, and chance. Their leader, a self-declared prophet named Telemenes, used a modified version of the board in temple rituals, asking followers to slide stones while chanting. Truth in motion, not in form. The cult did not last, but the saying did. In later markets across the Aegean, when deals went bad, people would shrug and say, "It's a Hermes count," meaning uncertain but not dishonest. A fragment found in Alexandria. Centuries later, in the archives of the Great Library of Alexandria, a Roman-era scholar discovered a wax tablet with a crude drawing of the original Hermetic board, and this note beneath. Too clever by half, but it amused him. "We used it until it broke. Then we remembered how to count." Scholars remain divided on whether the note was sarcastic or sincere. The irony of divine inefficiency. The real lesson of Hermes' abacus may be this. He did not fail because the device was poorly made. He failed because it had too many meanings. It could count. It could predict. It could symbolize. It could confuse. It was, in every way, a tool of Hermes himself, a god of contradictions, tricks, commerce, and messages never fully understood. And so it lived a short life as a calculator, a longer life as a symbol, and an eternal one as a mild annoyance to clerks. Years after his initial market experiment, Hermes, still fond of the mortal world and its ever-complicating economics, returned to the Athenian agora. The abacus he devised had fallen into obscurity. It was no longer used by merchants, not even for show. A few copies remained in dusty corners of temples, displayed more as curiosities than tools. One was being used to prop open a window in a lamp-maker's stall. Hermes was not offended. He watched from a quiet bench as 2 fish sellers argued over how many eels had been promised, with one scratching tallies into wax and the other counting on his fingers. He smiled. They're still wrong, but they understand what they mean. The final version, too late to matter. According to a fragment preserved by a Roman scribe named Marcellus the Dutiful, Hermes did make one final version of his counting board. This one was smaller, more elegant, and crucially included written labels. Each row had simple indicators. Units sold. Silver received. Expected payment. Shortfall. Trust pending. The last row caused confusion, as no one could agree on what trust pending was supposed to measure. Some thought it was a poetic flourish. Others believed it referenced future deals based on good faith rather than immediate exchange. But by this point, simpler tools had won. Chalk tallies, handheld tokens, wax tablets. The new board never spread. It was found centuries later beneath a collapsed shrine near Corinth, wrapped in cloth and buried beside a small inscription. For clarity's sake, let no one use this. The unexpected inheritors. In the city of Delphi, far from Athens, a group of traveling traders adopted a modified version of the original Hermes board, not as a calculator, but as a game. They called it kaibinomioi, dice of the marketplace. Players would move tokens along grooves representing trade routes. Each groove corresponded to different risks: piracy, drought, delayed payment. Winning the game meant finishing a full cycle of trade, and returning to Delphi with your ledger intact. The game was frustrating. Sometimes it was unwinnable. Players joked that it felt like being cursed by Hermes himself, which may have been the point. Philosophical echoes. The philosopher Crates of Thebes, writing 2 centuries later, referenced the Hermetic board in a short essay about tools and truth. Some devices teach, others reveal. A few confuse, and by confusing, illuminate. The abacus of Hermes was not a tool for numbers, but a mirror for expectation. This quote was later carved above the entrance of a merchant school in Alexandria. Few students understood what it meant. One graduate reportedly said, "It means some gods are better poets than engineers." The stone and the scroll. A single limestone tablet discovered in 1851 during excavations near the Phoenix held a peculiar inscription, with no clear context. Count not the coin alone, but what it meant to promise. Slide the stone if you must, but record the silence that follows. No one knows who wrote it. Some believe it was from a priest of Hermes. Others argue it was graffiti from a scribe tired of ambiguous math. But it captures the essence of what the abacus became. Not a calculator, not a system, not even a tool, but a reminder that even gods can make things too clever for mortals to use. A legacy in absurdity. In modern times, the story of Hermes' abacus is sometimes told to students of history or technology as a humorous cautionary tale. About overdesign, about the gap between invention and utility, about how even divine intelligence can underestimate human attention spans. In a footnote of an obscure Athenian playwright's surviving works, a joke appears. Hermes once invented a device that confused his own priests. Apollo asked what it did. Hermes said, "It explains everything." Apollo replied, "Then it will explain nothing." The closing image. Picture Hermes' now winged feet hovering just above the marble dust of an abandoned marketplace, watching a child count figs on her fingers. She gets the number wrong. Her brother corrects her. They laugh. He smiles. He sets the latest version of the abacus down on a bench, unlabeled, smooth, simple, and walks away, unnoticed as always. The wind shifts, a pebble moves. No one sees it. Final reflection. Not all inventions are meant to be used. Some are meant to show what we don't need. Sparta was never designed for peace. It was a city of regiments, not neighborhoods, of iron bars, not coinage, of mess halls, not taverns. Every boy trained as a soldier, every woman trained to raise one. Every law and stone in the city pointed toward preparedness, control, survival. Their poets celebrated austerity. Their leaders distrusted talk. Their economy relied not on markets but tribute and discipline. And so, when the Ephors Sparta's 5 annually elected magistrates declared, in the year 480 BCE, that the city would observe a week of total peace, no one quite knew what that meant. Not even the Ephors. The reason for peace, a broken omen. The records, sparse but compelling, attribute the event to an incident at the temple of Artemis Orthia. During the annual Diamastigosis, a ritual where Spartan youths were whipped before the goddess, as a test of endurance, the sacred basin cracked. It split cleanly down the center without force. The priestess reportedly fainted. A goat fled the altar. The crowd uncharacteristically murmured. Omens were taken, entrails examined, birds observed. The conclusion, drawn with grim certainty by the city's diviners, was this: Sparta must not draw blood for 7 days. No hunting, no training, no combat drills, no punishments. Even executions, already rare, were suspended. The Ephors, after 2 hours of deliberation and some visible discomfort, issued the decree. The result was what historians would later call the week of stillness. Day 1, confusion. Spartan life was governed by repetition. Each day began with formation drills, spear routines, physical inspection, and a series of punishments or corrections. These were absent now. Soldiers assembled and stood still. An officer asked if standing in formation was still considered training. No one answered. At communal meals, silence reigned as usual, but the absence of bruises was noted. One boy was caught practicing strikes with a shadow. He was told to sit. He cried not from punishment, but from being denied the routine. That night, an official record noted. No one shouted. Several forgot how to whisper. Day 2, adjustment. By the second day, odd behaviors emerged. Without combat practice, soldiers were seen packing aimlessly or stacking stones, then knocking them down, then restacking them. Some took to measuring the distance between columns in the training yard. A few elders proposed bringing out mathematical exercises to keep the youths focused. This was rejected as Athenian softness. The cooks, having no bruises to tend or feasts to prepare, began experimenting with spices. One dish included mint, a rarity. It was not well received. One officer wrote, "Men do not know how to chew when not angry." Day 3, conversation accidental. Spartans were not trained in rhetoric. Dialogue was brief, utilitarian. But without orders to bark or formations to critique, soldiers began to talk. Not debates, not arguments, conversations. One guard was overheard asking another, "Do you think Artemis meant never to bleed, or just not this week?" The other replied, "If she meant forever, the goat would have spoken." A boy asked his trainer what he used to do before becoming a soldier. The trainer had no answer. He'd never considered the question. Day 4, the letter. From the north, a courier arrived from Eli's, bearing a wax-sealed message. "Bandits on the northern road. Your patrols are missed." The ephors met. Could defensive action be taken without violating the peace? They debated the definition of blood drawn. One suggested using wooden weapons. Another proposed spooking the bandits with noise. Ultimately, they sent no one. This inaction was noted with a mix of guilt and relief. The road remained unpatrolled. And nothing happened. Day 5, the garden. With nothing else to do, some Spartans wandered to the edge of the Eurotas River, where stay-toned groves stood largely untended. A group of women mothers of soldiers began pruning, weeding, gathering herbs. 2 boys joined, then a third. By the afternoon, someone had organized rows of olive shoots. A soldier muttered, "We are growing discipline instead of swinging it." The comment was preserved, scratched into a wax tablet found centuries later beneath a layer of soil near the garden. Day 6, anxiety. The peace began to fray. Some boys were caught shadowboxing in their sleep. Others began waking early and running laps, unsanctioned, to release the energy. The priest had said 7 days. But the city missed its strictness. A sergeant half asleep ordered a man to clean his shield, then caught himself, then stared at the shield anyway. One boy confessed he liked the quiet. He was reported for unusual sentiment. No action was taken. Day 7, the end approaches. On the final day, people waited for signs. Would Artemis send a bird? Would the basin mend itself? Would the silence be lifted? At sunset, a junior priest stepped forward, holding a new basin carved from local stone, uncracked. She placed it on the altar. No blood was offered. Just barley, and a small whisper of a prayer. The omens were clear. The peace had served its purpose. No record explains what that purpose was. By the 4th day of the mandated peace, Sparta had become a city of active non-doing, a place where Shields were polished but not raised. Spears were inspected but not brandished. Feet marched in formation but went nowhere. The ephors, ever alert to signs of disorder disguised as reflection, held brief meetings not to enforce the law, but to confirm that nothing continued to happen. In a now-lost scroll preserved by a Corinthian observer, one ephor was quoted as saying, "We've discovered a kind of training that requires no movement, the exercise of restraint." That particular ephor was mocked later, but for the moment, his words held. Idle soldiers and the poetry of monotony. The Spartans were not known for verse, but even the hardest walls grow moss in still weather. With combat drills suspended, some of the older hoplites began almost reluctantly to compose short verses. These were not lyrical odes. They were gruff, clipped, and uncomfortable. But they were poems nonetheless. One such piece, etched on a training yard wall in faded ochre, read, "The spear leans heavy. When not aimed at flesh, it tilts toward memory." This was not a transformation into Athenians, but it was, as one young observer noted, like watching a wolf discover its reflection. The Helots notice. The Helots, Sparta's oppressed agricultural underclass, watched the city's inactivity with unease. Normally beaten, patrolled, and monitored, they now found themselves largely ignored. Patrols ceased, punishments halted. Even the dreaded Cryptia, Sparta's secret police, were grounded. Some Helots tried to avoid attention by continuing to work diligently. Others paused and waited to see if the gods truly meant for the whip hand to go still. One elder Helot, unnamed but referenced in a Rhodian scribe's private notes, was overheard saying, "If peace is divine, it is not ours to trust." No rebellion came. Just confusion. And a new kind of silence. The problem of the boys. The agoge, Sparta's brutal education system for boys, was perhaps the most affected by the peace. 15-year-olds, denied their beatings and contests, turned to games. These games were not traditional or approved. They involved guessing thoughts, miming stories, and on the fifth day a short-lived effort to invent a quiet war. In quiet war, two teams moved silently in a courtyard, trying to capture each other with gestures and glances. No touching, no shouting, no strikes. One instructor stopped them, but then, unsure whether it counted as violence, allowed it to continue. That night he confided to another. "They are not gentler, only cleverer at conflict." A visitor from Athens. On the sixth day, a delegation from Athens, hearing of Sparta's unusual cease in violence, sent a single envoy, a philosopher named Philocleon, known for his mocking wit. Philocleon arrived, bowed too deeply, and said, "I have come to see what Sparta looks like when it's not sharpening something." He was given water, not wine, and allowed to walk the agora. He noted the absence of argument, the blank stares, the men polishing spears without purpose. He returned to Athens and wrote, "Imagine a forge with no fire, a bow with no string, a flute held to the lips but never blown. That is Sparta in peace." Spartans never read the essay, but his sandals were burned at the city gates 2 months later. The problem of interpretation. On the evening of the sixth day, debate broke out not about whether peace was ending, but about what had been learned. Some argued that the week had demonstrated that Sparta could function without war, that order alone was sufficient. Others feared that peace bred softness, even in silence. One trainer reported that his boys smiled unprompted. Another said they had begun asking questions. A third demanded drills resume immediately at the first stroke of midnight. The ephors did not clarify. They simply reminded everyone. One more day. A war without weapons. That final day, Spartan society became a strange theater of unspoken competition. Men held their breath longer in river currents. Boys stood statue, still in mock duels of endurance. Women wove cloth as fast as possible, racing time instead of each other. Even without strikes or shouting, the city competed. One observer remarked, "They turned peace into a new kind of contest." This may have been the truest Spartan trait of all, the inability to exist without trial. The sundown ceremony. At dusk, as the sun dipped behind Taygetus, the temple of Artemis Orthia filled with quiet bodies. There was no music, no choral chant, just the slow walk of priests carrying a new basin, this one carved from wood, with olive branches bound around its rim. It was placed gently on the altar. No blood, no cracked stone, just a shallow offering of barley and a whisper, "May the silence be remembered." Then the priestess declared, "Let the spear be lifted." And Sparta exhaled. Immediate aftermath. At midnight, drills resumed. The agoge reactivated, shields were tested, swords weighed. A boy tripped during a formation and was corrected with immediate force. The city sighed in relief, not regret. But something had changed. One instructor noticed that, during formation, the boys moved in tighter sync than before. Another said his squad responded to commands faster, as if the silence had honed their hearing. The peace, though brief, had trained something. On the morning after the decree was lifted, Sparta roared back to life. Spears clattered against shields. Orders were barked in the training fields. A boy was corrected for blinking too slowly during a march. Yet something had softened, or at least shifted. It wasn't weakness, it was awareness. A kind of ghostly aftertaste to silence. One of the elder trainers noted. The city returned, but not all at once. Some part of it stayed behind. The week of peace did not undo Sparta's identity, but it frayed its edges, revealing threads most didn't know were there. New habits quietly kept. In the months following the stillness, small behavioral changes persisted among certain Spartans. One commander held longer silences before issuing commands. A group of young soldiers created a nonverbal code using finger gestures, inspired by the quiet war game. Several women continued tending the grove outside the Eurotas, citing calm in repetition. Even among the helots, there was whispered speculation that the gods had shown Sparta something and taken it back before it could be fully understood. The memory of the garden. Of all the moments from the peace, the tending of the garden had become the most quietly discussed. It was said that olive trees planted during that week grew faster than others. Some claimed they bore fruit with fewer blemishes. One tree was even nicknamed Artemis, branch not officially, of course, but in the murmured language of servants and watchmen. The ephors later ordered the garden to be pruned back. Sparta is not an orchard, one said. Yet the trees remained, and occasionally under moonlight, soldiers still walked among them, touching the bark, counting the leaves, never speaking. A law proposed, then forgotten. In an obscure fragment of Spartan legal records written in hurried Doric on a cracked wax tablet, there is reference to a motion put forward in the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, to consider, once per turning of the moon, a day of stillness. No drills, no hunts, no blood. The motion was never ratified. It was deemed unnecessary and likely dangerous. The proposer's name was scratched out. But some historians believe the idea lingered, not as law, not even as tradition, simply as possibility. Outsiders begin to talk. News of Sparta's silent week eventually reached other city-states, most notably Corinth, Thebes, and Athens. Athenian playwrights mocked the event in comedies, portraying Spartans struggling to express feelings or failing to understand what to do with a loaf of bread during peacetime. One line from an Athenian stage farce survives. He holds a spear but speaks in herbs. In Corinth, a minor philosopher wrote a pamphlet titled, "Peace in the Blood, the Spartan Experiment." It was banned in Sparta naturally, but a single copy survives today, preserved in the National Library of Greece. It concludes, "A city can be taught stillness, but only once. After that, it becomes aware of its own momentum." The boy who remembered. 10 years after the week of stillness, a soldier named Melas, who had been a boy in training during the event, led a detachment during a minor border skirmish. In the official report, he is noted for refusing to execute prisoners, instead offering them food and sending them to a helot village for custody. When questioned, he reportedly said, "I learned once that war is not a commandment, only a preference." He was fined, not exiled, and his name disappeared from military reports thereafter. The final olive tree. 200 years later, during the Roman occupation of Laconia, a naturalist named Gallus Vibius, documenting regional flora, identified an unusual cluster of unusually old olive trees near a dried grove outside ancient Sparta. One bore a carved line. Day 7, the basin did not crack. Vibius made a note, translated to Latin as, "Local superstition attributes these trees to a week of enforced quiet. No further explanation given. Soldiers refused to speak of it." The grove was marked on his maps as Silva Stilla, the Grove of Stillness. It remains there today. The legacy of the unspoken. Sparta, of course, returned to its true self. It waged war. It trained children in pain. It guarded borders. It resisted change. But for 1 week it paused. And in that pause, it remembered something deeper than blood or victory. That identity is fragile. That even the most hardened cities contain a silence waiting to be heard. And that peace, though uncomfortable, is possible even if only for 7 days.